Welcome to the Kwok and Roll podcast. I am your host, Kwok Pui Lan. Today's guest is Dr. Thomas J. Oord, who has proposed an open and relational theology. If you can't believe in the traditional concept of God, who is rigid, judgmental, and omnipotent, he may have something to offer to you. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
He teaches theology at Northwind Theological Seminary, and he has published a lot of work on the subject, open and relational theology. Now, Tom, let me ask you, why do we need to speak or believe in God, as our atheist and agnostic friends will ask?
Yeah, that God question. It's a big one. Many people have been hurt by theology, or at least people who believe in God. And many portraits of God have been offered that, at least to me, don't make very much sense. It's quite understandable why many people would walk away from belief in God, become agnostic, atheist, or some sort of non-theistic tradition. And yet, if we look at the polls, not only in America, but in much of the world, we find that the vast majority of people still do say they believe in God of some sort or another. You ask them for the details of what that God is like, of course, you're going to get lots of varieties. My strategy, at least the last 30 years or so, has been to ask what portrait or vision or way of thinking about God might not only make sense in the world in which we live in, but also might fit our deepest intuitions about what's good and beautiful, and most importantly, about what is loving. I grew up in a Christian tradition. I left it and was an atheist for a while, and then I returned, and it was those themes of love that I found in Jesus of Nazareth, and that were talked about by at least some in the Christian tradition. It was those themes that drew me back and made me wonder, or made me believe that perhaps a more loving portrait of an actual God could be given. And I understand why people want to walk away from God language, but I think maybe the God word might be salvageable if we start with the themes of love and we keep in mind not only our own experiences, but the wide diversity of experiences we see in others in our world, not just humans, but non-humans as well. I don't want to come to this podcast pretending I have God all figured out, because I don't. I'm not even certain there is a God, but I think it's plausible. I think there are actually good reasons to believe there's what I like to call a universal spirit of love who is active in our lives and in the universe.
You have proposed this open and relational theology. What is the problem of traditional theology leading you to take a different approach?
Well, there's so many problems in traditional theology. I sometimes just separate traditional theology amongst, we'll call it the average person on the street, and traditional theology amongst academic theologians. So let me start with the God on the street. The God on the street, the way people understand God, who are just kind of normal, everyday people, they typically think of God as angry at them most of the time, that anything bad happens is God punishing them, that God has this list of rules, and if you step outside of them, God's going to get you in some way or another. That this God really doesn't want to hang around you and only intervenes from time to time to do something, whether it's good or bad. Maybe it's a miracle and it's a good thing. Maybe it's to exact punishment and because you deserve it for your sin. And so it's this interventionist kind of God who's not very nice and is either in control of everything or can control and does sometimes to make sure whatever important needs to be done gets done. That's kind of the common view of the God I reject. In the academy, and here I mean by the academy mostly the Western Christian although you find this in Islam and some parts of Judaism. There's a picture of a God who is not intervening because not really affected by what we do. This God is, to use Talikian language, the ground of being, or use the language of Thomas Aquinas, pure act without potentiality, all those sophisticated philosophical language, which amounts to saying this academic God is outside time, unemotional, unaffected, impassible, doesn't change in any respects whatsoever, and seems very inaccessible. In fact, folks in this camp often really like to use mystery to talk about God. God is incomprehensible. And the mystery card gets played, especially when questions of suffering and evil emerge on the table. And I don't like that vision of God either. This open and relational vision, it has three distinctive ideas that shape it. One is the relational idea. This is the idea that God is not only affecting us, but being affected by us. There's a kind of giving and receiving. That's what relationality is about, which means that not only does God make a difference in the world and in our lives, but we really make a difference to God. Our lives actually matter, not only in history, but to the God of the universe. And then the open side of open and relational theology has to do with the idea that instead of God being outside of time, seeing all of history, God actually moves through time like we do. The future is really open to God. God's not even sure what is going to happen. And the past is really over and done for God. So rather than being outside of time, non-temporal, timeless, and looking at all things all at once, God is moving moment by moment with us and all of creation in time into an open and yet to be determined future. Those two ideas are very uncommon in academic Western Christian theology. And then the third idea, the notion of love, is obviously really important to me and to open and relational thinkers. If you ask the person on the street or the academic theologian, is God a God of love? They're going to say yes, at least the vast majority. But then when you tease out what that looks, the academic theologian, the love of God is going to be totally different from anything that we understand. They're going to say it's a mystery. Somehow God can be loving and yet unemotional. Somehow God can be loving but not relational. Somehow God can be loving and yet determine things. And then the person on the street, they're going to say God is loving too. But the God they believe in is the one who's behind all the horrible things that have gone on, because in their view, God either caused the evils and pain and suffering in the world, or at least God allowed them because they're supposed to teach us a lesson or punish us. What I propose as an open and relational theologian is that God's love for you and me and everyone and everything, from quarks to quails to quasars, that love is uncontrolling. God is giving, empowering, inspiring, calling, wooing, but never overriding, never controlling, never taking away agency, always an ongoing, uncontrolling love relationship. That gives you a little bit of an idea of what open and relational theology looks like in comparison to these two categories that I've given, academic theology and the theology on the street.
Thank you. That is very helpful. As you were speaking, I think about those scholars that influenced my thought. For example, Process Theology by John Cobb and Catherine Keller, and Feminist Theology by Carter Haywood, who has written about mutuality of God and human beings. I wonder if you can share with the audience who are the thinkers, philosophers, theologians that influence your thought, leading you to formulate this understanding of theology.
Yeah, John Cobb was definitely a big influence in my life. I think of open and relational theology as a broad umbrella under which fits process theology. Well, actually, there's many different versions of process theology, but process theology is under that. But also some relational theology, some feminists, some what we call evangelical openness theology is under that as well. This way, I noticed amongst people who take theology seriously that sometimes we would share a common vision of what I call an open and relational God, but we would have differences on more specific things. And I thought maybe we should come together under this big umbrella, the process people, John Cobb and Catherine Keller and others, as well as more conservative folks, Clark Pinnock and John Sanders and Greg Boyd and those folks. And I've been influenced by all of those things. I have my own little version of open and relational theology that shares some similarities with John Cobb and Catherine Keller, but also Clark Pinnock and Greg Boyd. And my view is that we should let 1,000 flowers bloom, but also have some core convictions about a God of love and try to tease that out in whatever ways seem best given the place we are in the world, our background, our communities, and other factors.
You have written many books on the subject, but you have started to write the first systematic theology of love in 3 volumes. Why did you want to write a systematic theology of love?
Thanks for that question. The idea came to my mind talking to John Cobb back in, I think it was 1997. Or I asked him if there was a systematic theology. And he said, no, the closest we have to that is a book by a guy named Daniel Day Williams called The Spirit and the Forms of Love. Williams was a really bright theologian who died much too early, I think about in the early 70s. And I said to myself when John said that, I thought, well, maybe someday I'll try to do that. I'll try to write a systematic theology of love. And systematic theologies aren't for everybody. Not everyone should write one. But I'm the kind of person who really likes to think through the rational coherence of ideas. I'm averse to contradictions. And I thought what I'm most committed to is a God of love. And I have a way of thinking about love. I think love is intentional action in real relationships with God and others in our world with the goal or the aim to promote well-being or flourishing. I sometimes call it overall well-being. I think that core idea or orienting concern, that might function well as a kind of systematic focal point. And it would be, as far as I know, the first attempt to write a book with the title A Systematic Theology of Love. I'm not saying other people don't care about love, but just that way of systematizing about love, I think, is quite unique. I should also say that I've gotten lots of strange looks from people in more progressive circles when I say I'm writing a systematic theology. And I think I know one of the reasons for that. I asked ChatGPT to give me a list of the current top 30 best-selling systematic theologies. And so it cranked out this list of 30. The number one bestseller, and has been for decades, is by an evangelical theologian named Wayne Grudem. The next 29 are also written by white, reformed evangelical men. As if you're looking around the world and wondering who's writing systematic theologies, you're not probably going to look for someone who's progressive or of color or a female or some non-male. And I think many people have just said, well, I guess systematic theologies are for that group. And then while I was reading Wayne Grudem's systematic theology, he had this line where he said something to the effect of, progressive theologians can't write systematic theologies. And I thought, oh, yeah? I guess, and one other reason prompted me to begin this project, I'd already written so many different books that it touched on the main topics or loci in systematic theology. I thought, well, I've kind of thought through a lot of these issues already. I can bring those together and then fill in the gaps that I haven't worked through. And maybe by the end, the 3-volume systematic theology, I can have something that would not only help me as I think through my ideas, but could be helpful to others in the future.
And you have already published the first book on God and creation. Instead of the traditional way of conceptualizing this question, that is Genesis 1 and 2, and also how God created, whether it's creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing or whatever. No, you start with love. For you, is God the universal spirit of love or something like that?
Well, I figured if I was going to have love at the center of my systematic theology, I had to begin by giving the reader an idea of what love is, as I understand it. The truth is that the vast majority, I'm tempted to say all, but at least the vast majority of theologians who talk about love never even define it. You don't really know what it is. And part of the reason they don't is that love in the sacred scriptures. I'm a Christian and I'm drawing primarily from Christian and Hebrew sources, but love in those scriptures isn't clearly defined. And there's real contradictions there. As a systematic theologian who wants a consistent and coherent presentation of a God of love, you have to make decisions when you're working through the texts and the traditions, etc. So I wanted to start with love, give people an idea what I thought was meant by that, and then talk about what I think fundamentally divine love looks, and then begin building from there. And there are lots of unusual things about my book because I start with love. Some of them I've already mentioned about like God's relation to time. If you think God is timeless, it's really hard to imagine God being engaged in giving and receiving moment by moment love if God is timeless, right? I get rid of the timeless God view. If God is impassible and immutable, it's really hard to imagine how God is going to be forgiving and compassionate, which is all over in the sacred scriptures. I get rid of a God who's impassible and immutable, et cetera, et cetera. And then, as you hint at there, when I come to God and creation, I reject the creation out of nothing view. I reject it on biblical grounds. I reject it on grounds related to love, the problem of evil. But I have a whole chapter laying out the reasons why creation out of nothing doesn't work for me and why other creation theories have been on offer and none of them quite work. And then I propose a brand new theory of creation. I say we should think of God as everlastingly creating. I call it the ever creator. And in every moment, God creates in relation to what God previously created, motivated by love. And this creative process had no absolute beginning. Most theists will say God had no absolute beginning. God is everlasting or eternal. I say God has been creating everlastingly. That's a new theory, I think, motivated and shaped by my deeper commitment to a God of uncontrolling love.
I want to probe a little deeper because
Good.
when you think about God as the universal spirit of love, and when you just talk about God in such a way, I was wondering whether you still, in the back of your mind, think about God as a being, if not sitting in heaven, but at least in a very personal term. While some process theologians may not want to see God as a being, or you cite Tillich. Tillich talks about ground of being, rather impersonal, isn't it?
Yeah.
In your mind, do you think that God is ground of being or something like that?
I love that question. I've got a whole chapter on that question. I'm glad you asked it. Because I think if we look at the sacred text, the image of God there is of a personal God. In fact, some of the language has that God with an actual body, although I personally don't think God has a localized divine body running around the earth. But Moses sees God's butt. on the mountain. Adam and Eve walk with God in the garden. There's all these anthropomorphic language about God having a particular body. And yet there's other parts of sacred scripture that describe God as ruach, as pneuma, as a spirit. In fact, many passages suggest God is present everywhere. As a systematic theologian, you have to make some choices here. Are you going to say God is a localized being who lives up in the clouds, who comes down every once in a while and then does something, but basically is a bigger version of one of us or a creature of some kind? Or are you going to say God's this universal spirit without a localized body? Well, I want to go with the latter, except that I think God can be a universal spirit and still be an intentional agent who's giving and receiving. That's crucial, I think, if we're going to really call God a lover. One of the problems with Tillich's ground of being is you don't have that giving and receiving agent kind of view of God. And Tillich, I think, is correct in criticizing the God of the body up in the sky who comes down every once in a while. I agree with that criticism. But I think you can actually believe that God is present to all creation as a dynamic relational agent of love. And you can overcome what I think are the liabilities of Tillich's ground of being thinking. Does that help any?
Yes, it helps. And I want to ask, you said we should not think about God as almighty, omnipotent, right? That is, we will go to theodicy later because this is very much related. If God is omnipotent, why God will allow all this suffering and evils in the world? And that is why you propose this. Is it omnipotent?
Yeah, I say omnipotent.
Okay.
Yeah, it's hard
Yes.
to say. Yeah, I, like a lot of folks, wrestle with the questions of evil. If God is perfectly loving and omnipotent, almighty, all powerful, whatever the language you like, then why doesn't this God stop the unnecessary suffering, the pointless pain, the horrific evils of the world? And that question led me to start to doubt that God has that kind of omnipotent, or what I now call controlling power. And I was giving up on a controlling God for quite some time, probably the last 20 years or so. I've not believed in a controlling God. But it was only in the last 5 years or so that I really studied the ancient Hebrew and Greek scriptures and discovered that every time in the Hebrew scriptures that you as an English reader come across the word almighty, it's a mistranslation of one of two Hebrew words, Shaddai or Sabaoth. Shaddai is, according to biblical scholars, better understood as something like the breasted one or the one of the mountains. And Sabaoth is something like the host or the leader of the armies. Neither one of those is all powerful or omnipotent or sovereign or anything like that. But when the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek in the writing of the Septuagint, the writers chose one Greek word to capture both Shaddai and Sabaoth. And that Greek word is pantocrator. It literally means something like all holding or all containing. And then in the writing of the New Testament, that word pantocrator shows up 10 times, 9 of them in the book of Revelation. One other time, the Apostle Paul is quoting from the Septuagint, and he uses the word pantocrator. Pantocrator is then seen by Jerome in about the 6th century when he's translating the scriptures, and he chooses the Latin word omnipotens, from which we get the word omnipotent. And that's why in the creeds, for instance, the Apostles' Creed begins, I believe in God the Father Almighty. Well, in Latin, that said omnipotence. That's a translation of pantocrator, which is a mistranslation of Shaddai and Sabaoth. My point here is that even though 99% of theologians I know call God omnipotent, there is no biblical support in the Christian and Jewish scriptures for that idea. I wrote a book on this called The Death of Omnipotence and the Birth of Omnipotence. And I quote tons and tons of biblical scholars to support this. that omnipotence, both the word and I also argue the idea, just aren't found in the sacred scriptures for Christians and Jews.
This is very helpful, especially for those who are not knowledgeable about the genealogy of this particular word and also the changes from Hebrew to Greek and Latin and then English. Now you have finished the first volume of your Systematic Theology of Love. What are the two other volumes? Have you thought about it already?
Yeah, I have thought about it. I earlier said that Wayne Grudem said progressives can't write systematic theologies. And I decided I was going to follow the more traditional order of topics that systematic theologians address. Usually, the first volume or the first part of a systematic theology is about God and then creation and etc. The second volume is going to start with revelation. How is it that we can say we even know something about God? And then move into, for Christians, we think of as the most decisive revelation of God, and that is in Jesus of Nazareth, and talk about how God is also revealed throughout creation. But what makes this Jesus guy special in terms of a revelation of God? And then I'll follow that with the questions of salvation. What does that mean? Sanctification. And then I'm going to really get in some sticky water. I'm going to try to work through the questions of Trinity. I know those are the kinds of things that some people really find important, other people just dismiss entirely. I'm going to have a chapter in which I lay out options for the Trinity. And if you go with the Trinity, this is what you're buying into. If you reject it, this is what you're buying into. That's the second volume. Third volume will address topics on religious pluralism, ethics, ecclesiology, eschatology, might have a science and religion chapter. And then the one difference between my order of a systematic theology and lots of others is that a lot of systematic theologies start with a chapter on methodology, and they give you philosophical arguments for why they have certain sources and their epistemology and that thing. I decided I'm going to put my methods chapter at the very end because for some people it's a boring topic. I suspect by the time people get to that chapter, they'll have a pretty good idea of what my methods are if they've read the whole thing. But that's the way I'm thinking about the next two volumes laying out.
This is going to be a very exciting project, and thank you for working on it. I know that your decision to pursue open and relational theology has caused problems to your church and sometimes in academia as well, because those people who subscribe to a traditional understanding of God or theology may not be open to open and relational theology. Can you share with the audience how has this affected your career or your relationship with the church?
Yeah, it's affected it in many, many ways. Some of them general, some of them very specific. I think in general, a lot of people really want to seek safety in the ideas they've been given, either by the tradition or ideas they've been given by their local church or pastor or grandmother or Sunday school teacher. And when someone like me comes along and presents a different way of thinking about God, even if, as I like to argue, I can find good biblical support for this vision, it's unfamiliar and it makes people uneasy and it makes them worry that maybe I've become too liberal or too something. But also, more specifically, this way of thinking about God has made me rethink questions about important cultural issues, especially questions about gender and sexuality. I actually changed my mind on LGBTQ plus issues, or I'm just going to use the word queer from here on out. I changed my mind on queer issues way back in the early 1990s when I was at a seminary in the conservative denomination, the Church of the Nazarene, that I was a part of. And in changing my mind on that, it was really a change of mind based on my study of scripture and thinking through things. It wasn't because someone of my friends or family members was queer or something like that. It was just, I really need to think my way through this. And I came to an affirming position. And then I thought, well, do I stay with this denomination or do I go elsewhere? And I stayed for three reasons. One, I thought that the denomination's core theological convictions revolved around love. The Church of the Nazarene is part of the Wesleyan or Methodist tradition, and John Wesley's theology is fundamentally a theology of love. I thought it was compatible with this new way of thinking about sexuality and gender issues. Secondly, I knew that there were beginning to be more and more people in the denomination who thought like I did, and I thought, well, maybe we could build a movement. And third, I wanted to be a theologian in one of the colleges or universities in the denomination. And I knew that a lot of people come to college with their questions of sexuality, at least at that time. That was the time they came to terms with themselves. And I thought maybe I could be of help with students in that process. I stayed in the denomination, was a theology professor for about 15 years, trying to help in whatever ways I could. But I lost my job in 2015. I went through a theology trial and had to go through before a couple of judges. I came through that without being charged as guilty, but my university president figured out another way to get rid of me. At that time, the queer issue was not the issue. It was this notion of God's uncontrolling love, the fact that I think God creates through theistic evolution, and those kinds of what were thought of as more progressive ideas. I lost my job in 2015. The president lost his job too. That's a whole nother story. And that then made me feel a little freer about talking about the queer issues in a more public way, because up to that point, I'd been mostly working through these ideas with students in private discussions, worried about what would happen if I was more public. But when I became more public in 2015, that really brought some concern and ended up charges were filed against me. I went through a hearing in 2022. I published a book of essays called Why the Church of the Nazarene Should Be Fully LGBTQ plus affirming, and that really caused problems. And by the summer of 2024, I had a third trial, and this was an official one from the denomination with judges and all that stuff. And the verdict of that trial, which I was not surprised with, is that they took away my credentials as a minister, but they also took away my membership. I was surprised about that. They defrocked me and they excommunicated me from the Church of the Nazarene. That's part of the price I've paid. I should say, I know my story's dramatic. I don't want people to get the sense that if they agree with my view on queer things, that they ought to do exactly what I did, because I think everybody's situation is unique and we have certain gifts and abilities and callings and resources that differ. And I'm not trying to impose my path on anyone else, but that's the path that I felt, well, I'll use God language. I felt the God of love was calling me to take.
I'm sorry to hear this ordeal and you paying a price for what you believe in, that is a loving God and an open and relational God. Thank you very much for sharing your journey with us and sharing these exciting projects of systematic theology of love. And I wish you all the best in finishing the rest of the 2 volumes. Thank you for joining the podcast.
Thank you for the opportunity. I really enjoyed the conversation. I love your questions, and thank you so much for allowing me to share a little bit of my journey.
I enjoyed the conversation very much too.
Good.
If you find the podcast helpful to you, please click like, comment, and subscribe. I will see you in the next episode.